Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This paper was written in September 29th of 2014 and October 1st of 2014. In the name of Allah, the most merciful. One would not need to model an actor via the modus operandi. Rather, the operational mode itself should be investigated. Although jihad, struggle, is a defensive war waged, ultimately the objective is to take certain jurisdictional rights over a territory. The jihad is waged in counteraction to the occurrence of persecution, in such extent that persons are forced out of their homes and in danger of continued aggression. Although the notion of continued aggression does not correspond to being forced out of the home, it is an implicit consequence of the event that it occurs. In the majority proportion that the persons are forced out of their homes for persecution, continued aggression is very proximate for an exceeding duration of time. The War on Terror is a war initiated from the mission to expel the evil dictator Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party for demonstrable evidence of a foreign policy agenda to project diplomatic powers through non-state militias. The War on Terrorism is also known as the coup d'etat of Saddam Hussein. It is a mode of operation to eliminate the power structure of the government of Iraq by replacing employees. It was expanded to 3 tiers of professional public services in the government of Iraq. This mode of operations to eliminate and replace the government workers of the nations is repeated in other nations during the succeeding span of time by other tactics: non-state militias to overthrow the government, civilian protests to cause change in official status and leadership, coalition of the United Nations to fulfill a military campaign. While the tactics are varied, the same mode of operations is initiated in effort to replace the government. Though there are controversies about tactics and legality of some events, there is a mode of operations that remains critical and active. It is the cause for eliminating officials and officers by force from the Office of Public Service in order to replace them, including to encompass the judiciary of the state. Several historic events which act dynamically at a global level right now are out of declarations of territorial or sovereign right. The practice of conquering territory and imposing sovereign rights over its inhabitants founded all nations since ancient history, and repeats in the most recent history that are named and acting in the present time. Most recently are the dissolution of Yugoslavia into smaller states, the establishment of Israel, the secession of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the formal acting status of Hamas in the West Bank and Gaza. There is a broadcasting campaign to insist the premise of terrorism that it is an Islamic phenomenon, and the benefit of Islamizing the nuclear program of Iran. The fight of non-state militias is the ability of them to be targeted based on that vector. Reducing the conflict with Iran to ideological differences will serve to make an international pressure system that disorients Iran, and this disorientation will make them more unstable and cause ambivalence. This also enforces the definition of terrorism as an Islamic phenomenon, and therefore extending to international law the legal and remedial policy efforts. In order to start effective national defense systems, the national defense objectives of the United States are a model of every nation's interest. The national security fulfillment by the officials and officers protects the people of the nations from their highest vulnerability to predatory groups. And this should be recognized by all regular citizens of the nations as importantly beneficial to their livelihood. Russia returns periodically to attest that the global politics must be permitted to develop multipolar. One major factor of this theory is to let multipolarity develop is upon the principle of non-interference with states, especially known for their violations of international law, humanitarian law, and laws of war. Although an integral function of the United Nations is to insulate national sovereignty from the effects of foreign diplomacy across time, the United Nations Charter was gathered upon as provoked by one specific premise. The premise was the Holocaust of Germany and the initiation of World War II, which begot massive losses worldwide. In Germany, the impunity with which emboldened the advance of the war of aggression and the Holocaust inspired a charter of the United Nations, whose purpose set forth that the mission shall be maintained of international peace and security. The challenge of terrorism is not as it were defined attack civilian, non-military targets, state in effort to instill fear. The problem is that the state is unable to anticipate or adapt to this type of attack because it does not have the capacity to predict where the threat might be coming from, or that the threat might arise simultaneously at different locations without a detectable cause. Drone campaigns against terrorism is an unusual tactic because it assumes the suspect and the national government to be in excess of the territorial jurisdiction. It is a non-nationalistic war. Like a war without borders, drone strikes and terrorism campaigning assumes that the target does not have intelligence value if caught alive, or that capital punishment is more satisfactory to be accomplished outside of regular judicial procedure, if the state would not cooperate in apprehending threats. There is a dramatic supposition that the persons of a foreign nation have an interest in attacking the United States of America, and providing this that it is necessary to act as a superintendent of nations to gather the threat intelligence. The purpose of supranational war, such as this war on terrorism, is to compensate for unpredictable surfacing of threats when the target is unable to hold a state as an accountable or willing party to cooperate, if the actors are in its borders plan to carry out attacks. The cost of apprehending the suspects or the immediate interest to apprehend threats to a foreign country is not a realistic expenditure of the state in effort to project the foreign policy. States are competitors to other states. To prosecute these actors within the nation according to the foreign state perception of their threat value to the foreign state may cause the state to become susceptible to the policy of the foreign state. There is a competition of interests in the international policy, which we are aware international policy is driven by the global market as projected from domestic livelihood and guaranteed by the right of sovereignty. Because we can recognize administration and business as a facet of the world's security and world peace, the electoral process and the investment powers of the nation should be seen as the most significant markers of success in the mission of the United Nations. Allahu Akbar. And I just want to take a minute to recognize what's happening in Syria now. The Israelis have, in the past couple of weeks, done a greater frequency of attacks on targets in Syria, which they said were the Iranians trying to transport, weapons of mass destruction like missiles capable of chemical weapons delivery. So they stepped up some attacks, and then in the past week, we've seen the Assad and Russian government start some bombardments on the areas around Idlib. So, and also, we are working on a project now for Safe Balud, and we have no computer. The computer overheated and is broken. So, Allahu Akbar.